This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. So I've got some good news to start the show out with this week. It's been previously reported here on this program that all the fish, specifically the trout, in Wyoming drowned in a great flood, right? We've got plenty of carp here, but we don't have any trout left. That's what I've been telling everybody at any rate. But I went out over the weekend. Well, it was on Friday, which in my book, that kind of starts the weekend for me. That is, as soon as I step out of work on a Friday is when the weekend begins. But I went out with a buddy of mine. We went fishing and we found some trout. Okay. We found a whole bunch of brown trout. It was actually a lot of fun. You know, kidding aside about our fish that have drowned. It was really interesting because we're right in between, on a lot of the creeks, we're right in between things warming up a little bit and then runoff, which is going to happen any minute now and blow everything out. We'll be stuck on tailwaters, but we got out and I've never fished these creeks this time of year before. So it was really interesting to see how the fish were acting. And I caught probably a dozen, and most of them were like 4 inches long. A bunch of really tiny fish, but you know, catching fish better than no fish. And I think it's a good way, if you can get out this time of year, it's a good way to really learn what those subtle takes look like, because these grabs were not very aggressive. I didn't have a fish come up for a dry. They were all hitting the nib. So, and I'm just fishing a dry dropper rig, but the takes were really soft, especially from like a 4-inch fish. They're going to be really soft on fish that small anyways. But it was a really good time to be out on the water. The weather was great, kind of shook off some of the cobwebs that you get during the winter when it's 30 below zero and you can't fish. So, well, you can't fly fish. You can ice fish, but I tip my hat to those folks who can ice fish, because that's not me. Just not my cup of tea. But anyways, welcome to it, folks. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. We've got a wonderful little show lined up for you today. We are going to be chatting about untangling leaders and tippet, which everybody needs to hear about that. Let's just be real. All right. We're going to go through the top 5 flies from the Ventures Fly Co. crew, me, Alex, and Bertrand. We're also going to chat about fishing eddies. No, I don't mean your buddy Eddy. I mean like the eddy in the river. And then the best floatant that you should be using. So this is not a bit that you're going to want to miss. All right. I want to jump right into it. We are going to discuss. You know what? I was thinking of shaking the show format up here, and I think we're going to jump right into leaders and tippets. So this question comes to us from Isaiah from Pennsylvania. Isaiah says, after tying on a new leader, my decent-sized dry flies, 14 and 16, caused my leader to twist up at the end, causing a huge knot and causing my flies to spin after they land on the water. Any idea what's causing this? Isaiah, I think you might be our first person to submit a question from Pennsylvania. So thank you very much. Appreciate the question. And this is a really good question. There's a few things that can be causing this issue. We're going to start at what I think might be the most likely, and then we'll move up from there. So first off, are you straightening your leader and your tippet before you start fishing? Especially if it's a brand new leader, like you said, it's all tight and coiled up, right? It's been wound around itself and stuck in that little bag. You pull it out, you put it on your line. If you don't straighten that leader, it's going to twist up on itself. It happens all the time if you don't take the time to straighten them. They sell like the straightening patches, like a piece of leather or cotton that you run the leader through. I've never used those. I just run it through my fingers. Just try not to burn yourself. It's a good way to warm your fingers up when it's cold, I guess. But always take the time to straighten your leader out. Tippet usually doesn't have to be straightened too much, but leader definitely does. And if it's sat on your reel all winter long, definitely straighten it. If this is like your first couple of days fishing after a long winter, you definitely want to straighten that leader out. The next thing is, what size of leader are you tying on? Because if you use a leader that's too light for bigger flies, you can run into the problem that you're describing here. 6X would probably be too small for those bugs. I kind of hesitate to say that because there's instances where you might want to use 6X on a 16, but those are pretty rare. So personally, I wouldn't go anything. I'm kind of weird. I like to fish 4X as much as I can just because I have enough friends who are guides and I've fished with enough guides and I've guided enough myself that trout aren't as leader shy as we make them out to be unless you're on those really pressured fisheries. Then they are pretty leader shy, but you can usually get away with that good 4X tippet, and I usually do. So look at your leader size as well, because that could be causing this issue. And then the last thing that could potentially be giving you grief here, Isaiah, is wind knots or tailing loops. Now, these happen if you don't have your cast timing down just right. You kind of end up tangling the end of your leader on your forward or your back cast, right? So an extreme example of this would be like when you hear that crack on your back cast, like it sounds like you're Indiana Jones out there or something running away from some raiders in a lost ark, right? You don't want that crack, obviously. I'm sure whoever taught you how to fly cast said, yeah, no, the first time you did that. Because I'm pretty sure we've all done that, right? We've all cracked the whip a little bit when learning how to fly cast. I mean, I didn't. Of course, I would never do that. And I've never done that just recently in front of a bunch of people. Yeah, never. No, it's something that's still easy to fall into if you're not an excellent caster. So the extreme example of not having your timing down is that crack, and that's going to cause your tailing loops or wind knot. A less extreme example of an instance in your casting stroke that's going to cause these same issues is when you start your forward cast before your fly line has completely unrolled behind you, right? So we're looking and we're making these loops with fly line in the air, and you don't want to start your next casting stroke until that fly line is straightened out. You push the rod forward and it puts it into that nice, beautiful loop. It unrolls, and then you move the rod backward. If you go just a little bit before that, it may not crack, but it will cause those tailing loops where the line's kind of tailing all over itself, and you end up with tangled leaders when it lands on the water. So I would recommend checking those issues out and seeing if adjusting those or fixing those helps you avoid these tangles. And if it does, awesome. If not, then please let me know and we'll get this thing figured out for you, Isaiah, because it's no fun. Definitely don't want to be in that situation. So thank you very much for the question. Really appreciate it. Our next question comes to us from Matt from Colorado. Says, I absolutely love the show. This is for episode 16. I've been tying flies for a long time. What are the guys' 5 go-to flies to tie? Keep up the good work. Matt, see, this proves that I don't make too many Colorado jokes, right? Oh, seriously, thanks for the kind words, man. I really do appreciate them. And thank you for giving us some feedback response to episode 16. I really appreciate that. I went ahead and asked the guys their top flies, and this is what we came up with. These are the flies that we all fish ourselves when we get time out on the water, and these are all flies that we like to tie ourselves as well. Alex went with the zebra midge in red, black, olive, or brown, a Frenchie, a scud muffin in pink, gray, or tan, a chubby Chernobyl, and a parachute Adams. Not a very surprising collection if you know Alex, although it's a little heavy on dry flies, and Alex usually fishes more nymphs, so it's kind of an interesting thing that he picked. Berkeley/Bertrand went with the guide's choice hare's ear, the woolly bugger with a black marabou tail, red black body and red ribbing, a thin mint with a pink bead, lightning bug, and a fluttering stonefly in gray or yellow. So interesting choices there from Berkeley. And then for myself, parachute Adams, elk arcatus, zebra midge, Frenchie, and the glow bug. I have caught a surprisingly large amount of fish, especially big fish, on a glow bug. even when there aren't like eggs in the water from actively spawning fish. It's just a good little nymph. And it's kind of one of those little confidence flies that I go to when the water's off color or when they're not really on to anything else. I throw a glow bug on. It's kind of like my San Juan worm. A lot of folks go to the worm because it works. I go to the glow bug because it works for me. So those are our top 5 flies for everybody here at the Ventures crew. Matt, that was a great question. Thanks for taking the time to write that for us. We all have questions, right? I mean, it's fair to question everything these days. We live in an era of instant information where we can fact check anybody, anytime, anywhere, on anything. With that being said, please don't fact check this podcast because, no, I strive to give a lot of accurate information here. And when things are only my opinion, I make sure it's very clear that it's my opinion. All the information that we share on the show here comes from industry professionals, folks who've been doing this for a long time, and my own experiences as well. So that's the value you get in submitting questions to Untangled, is you get not only what I think about it, but you get the benefit of all the industry experience. I do the research to go through these questions and make sure I'm giving you the best answer possible so that you can use that information, go and have some success out on the water. So if you've got a question about fly fishing, you'd like to get it answered, please send those questions in. There's always a link in the podcast description. That's what keeps this show running. And we really appreciate the questions that everybody sent so far. Thanks a whole bunch, folks. Our next question comes to us again from Colorado. See, there was some concern among the VFC brain trust that I was picking on Colorado too much. But a little bit of background: Alex spends quite a bit of time in Colorado with some work commitments for family, so he's kind of split time between Colorado and Utah at the moment. And I've spent quite a bit of time in Colorado for somebody who grew up in Utah. So I feel like, we can dunk on Colorado a little bit. Yeah, a lot of bit, actually. But it's always been funny because I go to Colorado. When I lived in Utah, I would go to Colorado and I'd come back to Utah and I'd breathe a sigh of relief. Like, man, thank goodness we're not Colorado. Now that I've lived in Wyoming, I go back to Utah and I'm like, shoot, Utah really is Colorado. It's just gotten a lot more crowded, a lot more people. And the fisheries just, they kind of take on like a different attitude. It's not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing. It's just different. It feels like you're in Colorado. It feels like you're in Utah. It feels like you're in Wyoming. And Utah has kind of been creeping that way. But anyways, I could go off on that tangent for forever, and I probably shouldn't. What I probably should do is actually answer Andrew's question. Andrew wrote in, he said, do you have any advice on how to fish an eddy? I came across one stacked with fat trout actively feeding on BWO emergers this weekend, and for the life of me, could not figure out how to make a good presentation to them. Appreciate any tips you might have. Thanks. Hey, Andrew, this is a really great question. I'm going to do my best to answer it for you. Eddies can be really tough. All right. Now, I'm just going to lay that out there right now. Anybody who says that eddies aren't tough probably has some beachfront property in Iowa to sell you as well. These eddies can be tough to fish. They're just, you've got all the different complex currents. You've got to get in the right position. You can't have any drag. They present a lot of challenges to overcome. All right. So my first bit of advice would be look at it that way. The challenge to overcome is a way to better yourself as an angler once you learn how to fish eddies. And even though you might have walked away from that eddy not having caught anything, you still walked away learning what didn't work. So don't lose sight of that aspect of it, because that is actually really valuable when you figure out what doesn't work. All right. And I'm saying that completely serious. I'm not being a jerk over here. So, take some solace in that. Now, the key to remember with eddies, all right, it's all about where you're standing. It's all about where you are in relation to that eddy. If you can't get a good angle on that eddy, it's going to be almost as hard as trying to get your mother-in-law to like you to catch those fish, right? Your mother-in-law is never going to like you. You are never going to catch fish out of an eddy if you don't have the right angle on it. Now, I'm not sure if there's a correlation between mothers-in-law liking you and fishing eddies. My mother-in-law freaking loves me, and I'm like, and I don't know, I can fish an eddy. I wouldn't call myself an eddy expert. So I don't know, maybe there is a correlation. Maybe you don't want to get too good at eddies, Andrew, depending on how your relationship with your mother-in-law is. But this is not a family advice show. This is a fishing show. So I'll shut up about that and get back to the eddies. The key to fishing an eddy is to place yourself parallel to the eddy. So if you're standing in a river and you're facing the eddy, then the current is going to be running right in front of you. So you're standing kind of perpendicular to the current, right? If you're standing straight up, the current's hitting the side of your thighs, depending on which way the current's going. You want to be parallel to the eddy. So it should be you, current, eddy, right there. This is all assuming that you're waiting. Of course, once you are parallel to the eddy, you want to try and get as close as you can to that eddy while waiting safely and not spooking any of the fish. If you can try to get within 2 to 3 rod lengths, because that's a very manageable distance. You can usually mend or high stick that above a current, which you're going to need to do as you fish this eddy. So aim for 2 rod lengths, no more than 3 rod lengths away from the eddy. Set yourself up parallel to it. Now that you're in the right spot, you should be able to cast just about any point in the eddy from where you're standing. When I fish eddies, I personally like to land a cast kind of in the middle on the outer edge. So I aim for there's top, middle, bottom of an eddy. I aim for the middle, but on the outer edge where the current is moving. Because if you plop it down where the current's not moving, any tiny bit of drag is just going to turn the fish off to that, because they can see that. They're so good at seeing that drag. So if your fly lands in the middle, but your tippet is not in the middle, or you're not able to high stick over all of the current, which you probably aren't, because it's just kind of tough to have that sort of reach and not spook the fish, then you're going to have drag almost instantly if that fly lands where there's no or almost no current in the eddy. You want to try and make sure that fly is there so that you can control the drag on the fly. Make sure the fly is landing in some current so you can control the drag on it by mending with that current. So I put my fly on the outer edge where the current's moving. That should carry the fly around to all the fish. Of course, if you are fishing an eddy that has fish actively rising in it, land your fly in front of the rising fish. Don't lead them too much, especially not in an eddy. Just kind of put it right there, and the fish usually react fairly quickly to that. I've fished a lot of little eddies back when I lived in Utah on the lower Provo River, back before the best section of the river got all privatized and you couldn't fish it anymore. I would be out there fishing the blue wing hatch right about now. Wonderful little hatch if you can get access to the private section of the Provo now. But I would fish eddies like this all the time, where I would just put that fly right in front of the rising fish and let them by maybe a foot at the most. Because usually your current in an eddy isn't cruising. It's not flying, right? It's pretty slow, pretty methodical current. So put that fly down in front of the fish, not too far. And I've found that the longer I try to lead a rising fish in an eddy, the fewer fish I end up catching. So just bear that in mind. And all this, again, this is all situational, right? I'm describing kind of like the ideal eddy setup where you can get parallel to it and where you can put the flies in front of the fish and you can high stick over the current. You don't have any drag and everything's rainbows and unicorns and every fish is 24 inches. But if we know one thing about fly fishing, it's that it's rarely ever ideal like that. All right. That's why you pay $8,000 to go to New Zealand, because it's all ideal in New Zealand. No, it's probably not. But I mean, that's what they would have you think. That's how they get you. That's how they get you to go there. And I haven't been, in case you can't tell. I'm not Not bitter about that at all. But the key with the Eddy, and I know I've said there's a lot of keys, but anything else on fly fishing is a presentation game. So if you are struggling to get a good presentation, I shouldn't say never, you're going to have a hard time catching fish. That holds true with eddies. If you are struggling to get the fly to present without any drag, you're going to have a tough time catching fish. So the key to eliminating that drag in an eddy obviously is going to be use as little line as possible. You don't want any more leader and tippet touching the water than you absolutely need to get your cast out. When I'm fishing eddies, I like to just, have 3 to 4 feet of fly line out of the tip of the rod, just enough fly line that you can move your leader and tippet without too much work. You can kind of pick them up, mend it. I've always found it's easier to mend your leader when you have a little bit of fly line out of the tip of the rod anyways. So that's what you're going for, is just giving yourself some control with the fly line out of the tip of your rod. But then make sure you are, like I said, getting as much of that line and leader off the water as you possibly can. That is where you are going to find a lot of success in eddies with dry flies. Now, if you're going to nymph an eddy, it really is kind of the same concept. You don't want drag on your indicator, right? But it's a little bit different because you have line on the water usually when you're nymphing, unless you're Euro nymphing. So it's a little bit of a different game. So this is a pretty dry fly focused answer to your question. I would say don't be afraid to tie on extra tippet to lengthen your leader so that when you cast, you can high stick the line and the leader off the water. Again, ideally, you only want your fly and maybe a few inches of tippet and leader touching the water in the eddy if you can. Again, that's an ideal scenario. If not, you make that cast and you've got to mend both against the current in the river and the current in the eddy. So you're making a lot of mends. Your drifts are going to be very short. Another reason why you don't want to try and lead the fish too much with that fly. All right. Now to end everything here with this question, I hope that made sense. I hope you can dissect that a little bit. If that wasn't clear enough, let me know. And that goes for any answer on this show, folks. If I ever give an answer that's not quite clear enough or you'd like more detail, reach out. All right. That's what we're here for. That's what I'm here for. That's what the show is here for, is let's make everybody better, including me as the guy behind the podcast mic. Right. So if you've got any questions or clarifications, please shoot them my way. And remember that this is not the only way to fish an eddy. Sometimes you actually will be able to be above or below the eddy. It really just depends on the situation. But this is the approach that I use often when I'm fishing eddies. And Orvis put out a wonderful video on how to fish an eddy. They went ahead and used this same approach to fishing an eddy. So you can watch that. I've linked it in the podcast description. You can watch that. That should help you visualize a lot of what I'm trying to say. But again, remember, at the end of the day, eliminate the drag, get yourself in a position where you can high stick and dead drift that through the eddy, and you should be good to go. Thanks a whole bunch, Andrew. Appreciated the opportunity to answer that question. And just like that, we are here on the last question of the show. So really quick, Nate from New Jersey. I think, Nate, you're also the first guy from New Jersey. First from Pennsylvania and a first from New Jersey today, I think. I could be wrong on that, but I think so. Awesome. We're getting the reach. We're seeing the show spread its little wings and take flight, right? Oh, Nate from New Jersey says, love the podcast. It has genuinely improved my fly fishing and has allowed me to pierce more lips than I can count. My question is about dry fly lubricant. Is it better to use liquid or dry? And how frequent should I be reapplying it? Also, is there a brand that's more superior to others? Well, Nate, first off, thanks a whole bunch. I really do appreciate the kind words. Really glad to hear that the podcast is helping out. And from the praises that you're saying, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you'd vote for Diet Coke over Coke Zero in the whole Diet Coke versus Coke Zero debate we've been having here, which we've been keeping count from feedback, and I believe we are tied. We're in a dead heat. So if you have a strong opinion about Diet Coke versus Coke Zero, let us know. We'd love to hear what you folks have to say. Anyways, Nate, let's get to your question here. When you're talking about lubricant, I'm assuming that you mean floatant, right? So with floatant, there's a ton of different options on the market for what you can get. You can get the dry stuff, like you said. You can get the wet stuff. You can get the dry shake stuff. You can get pre-treatment. You can get all sorts of things. It's kind of a confusing world, especially for beginners. Well, let's try and break that down a little bit. Generally, liquid floatant is going to last longer than a dry floatant. So what I usually do, this is my system that I've worked up for myself. I like how it works. I usually put liquid floatant on all my flies before I start fishing, and then I use dry floatant to dress the flies back up when the flies start sinking. So I know a few guys who will reapply the liquid floatant, and you can certainly do that. You just have to make sure that you get the fly pretty dry before you add the liquid floatant back to it. That's when I've had the best luck reapplying liquid floatant if I ran out of my dry floatant. Now, I am partial to the Loon Loxa liquid floatant, and then I like the Loon Top Ride for the dry floatant. I really like Loon stuff. They don't pay me anything, and this isn't like, I'm not going to sit here. Obviously, I work for Ventures Fly Company, right? I'm with these guys. But Loon makes a great product, floatant-wise. So that's what I'm partial to. That's what I use. Alex and Berkeley have their own stuff that they use, so I could pick their brains as well, and maybe I will. That'd actually be a really good episode to do. If you're trying to figure out like an impartial answer to that question, though, I actually found a really interesting test that the folks over at Murray's Fly Shop did. They tested a couple of different kinds of floatant against each other to see what one was the best, and I've linked that in the podcast description as well, so you can take a look at it, Nate. But that's really how I do my dry fly floatant system, and I'm really curious what everybody else does, because a lot of the anglers that I know, they all have kind of a different system. A lot of folks I know really like the pre-treatment style, where you actually soak the fly after you tie it, and that helps. That helps it float, and you don't have to put stuff on it when you're out on the water. So there's a lot of interesting ways to go about it. I'd like to know what you folks use. So drop us a comment on social media here, wherever you're listening to the podcast. Send us an email. Smoke signals, we get those here in Wyoming. Thankfully, the Pony Express is still strong here as well. So any way that you want to get that feedback to us, that'd be great. I'm real interested in what everybody's doing for their dry fly floatant these days. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode of the show. Very, very grateful to everybody that takes time to write in the questions. That's what keeps this show moving. So if you want this show to continue on its run of excellence here in the fly fishing world, then you're going to have to submit your questions. All right. And I know you've got them. All right. Even if it is, hey, Spencer, what's the best buffalo wing sauce? Or where's the best place to get pizza when I'm done fishing in Montana? Or, anything tangentially related to fly fishing. Just submit it on over here. We'd love to chat. And I'm really enjoying the time that I get to chat with folks and to answer these questions across the fly fishing world. So thanks everybody for submitting your questions already. And don't forget to have a good one. And until next week, tight lines, everybody.